I want her to be my new mommy, not any of you." The words rang out across the hushed cabin of the luxury private jet like a thunderclap, followed by the most deafening silence anyone on board had ever experienced. 7-year-old Emma's tiny finger pointed directly at Sarah, the flight attendant who had been quietly refilling water glasses just moments before. The crystal tumbler in Sarah's trembling hand nearly slipped as every eye in the first-class cabin turned toward her. 5 pairs of perfectly made-up eyes filled with shock, disbelief, and barely concealed fury, and 1 pair of steel-gray eyes belonging to billionaire tech mogul David Harrison, Emma's father. Sarah Chen had been working as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 8 years, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this moment. Standing there in her crisp navy uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, she felt like a deer caught in headlights as the most powerful man in Silicon Valley stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Surprise? Something else entirely? But let me take you back to where this extraordinary story really began, just 6 hours earlier at San Francisco International Airport. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. David Harrison was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. At 42, he had built Harrison Technologies from a small startup in his Stanford dorm room into a global empire worth $12 billion. His perfectly tailored Armani suits, his collection of vintage Ferraris, his penthouse overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, everything in his life was precisely curated, meticulously planned, and flawlessly executed. Everything, that is, except for one small problem. His daughter needed a mother, and David Harrison was determined to find her the perfect one. David Harrison was a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it. At 42, he had built Harrison Technologies from a small startup in his Stanford dorm room into a global empire worth $12 billion. His perfectly tailored Armani suits, his collection of vintage Ferraris, his penthouse overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, everything in his life was precisely curated, meticulously planned, and flawlessly executed. Everything, that is, except for one small problem. His daughter Emma needed a mother, and David Harrison was determined to find her the perfect one. Emma's mother, David's college sweetheart Jennifer, had died in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving behind a devastated husband and a confused 4-year-old who still asked when Mommy was coming home. Since then, David had thrown himself into his work even more obsessively, hiring a rotation of nannies to care for Emma while he conquered new markets and closed billion-dollar deals. But lately, something had been nagging at him, a persistent voice in the back of his mind that whispered, maybe, just maybe, money couldn't solve every problem. The idea had come to him during a particularly brutal board meeting about their expansion into the European market. If he could approach finding a wife with the same strategic thinking he applied to business acquisitions, surely he could find the perfect stepmother for Emma. Someone sophisticated, educated, beautiful, someone who could seamlessly fit into their world of charity galas, private schools, and summer homes in the Hamptons. So David Harrison did what he always did when he wanted something. He made it happen. Through his network of wealthy friends, business associates, and society connections, he had identified 5 exceptional women, each accomplished in her own right. Victoria Ashworth, a stunning former model turned art gallery owner from Manhattan. Celeste Morgan, a Harvard-educated lawyer who specialized in international corporate law. Madison Sinclair, a successful real estate mogul who had made her fortune flipping luxury properties in Beverly Hills. Priya Sharma, a renowned fashion designer whose boutiques catered to celebrities and socialites. And finally, Sophia Laurent, a sophisticated wine connoisseur who had inherited her family's vineyard empire in Napa Valley. Each woman was beautiful, successful, and exactly the type of person who belonged in David Harrison's meticulously crafted world. Each had agreed to join him and Emma on what he had pitched as a casual weekend getaway to his private resort in Aspen, though David's true intentions were far more calculated. This flight would be his opportunity to observe how each woman interacted with Emma, to see which one might naturally fill the role of stepmother he so desperately needed filled. What David hadn't counted on was Emma herself. The little girl with strawberry blonde curls and enormous green eyes, so much like her mother's, had always been shy around strangers. Since Jennifer's death, she had become even more withdrawn, clinging to her father when he was around and retreating into her shell when he wasn't. The parade of nannies had taught her to be polite but distant, to accept care from adults without forming real connections. David told himself this was just a phase, that Emma would warm up to the right woman when she met her. As they boarded the private jet that morning, David felt confident in his plan. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner he had chartered was fitted with every luxury imaginable: cream leather seats that converted to beds, a full bar, gourmet catering, even a small play area that had been specially installed for Emma. The 5 women arrived in a parade of designer luggage and expensive perfume, each greeting Emma with bright smiles and carefully chosen gifts. Victoria presented Emma with a beautiful hand-painted jewelry box from her gallery. "I thought you might like to keep special treasures in here, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of old Manhattan money. Celeste brought out an elaborate dollhouse, complete with tiny furniture and miniature figurines. "This is just like the ones I used to play with when I was your age," she explained, kneeling down in her designer suit to Emma's level. Madison offered a child-sized Louis Vuitton purse, declaring, "Every sophisticated young lady needs a proper handbag, don't you think?" Priya unveiled a collection of child-sized designer dresses from her own fashion line. "I designed these especially for you, Emma. We could be matching fashion twins." Sophia presented an elegant tea set with real china cups decorated with delicate roses. "Perhaps we could have a proper afternoon tea party together," she suggested with a warm smile. Each gift was thoughtful, expensive, and perfectly chosen to appeal to a young girl. Each woman was charming, engaging, and clearly making an effort to connect with Emma. And Emma accepted each gift politely, said thank you in her soft voice, and then retreated to the corner seat where she had placed her worn, stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hopscotch, the last gift her mother had given her. David watched this interaction with growing frustration. Why wasn't Emma responding? These women were perfect, successful, beautiful, clearly fond of children. What more could she want? The answer came in the form of Sarah Chen. Sarah had been assigned to this charter flight at the last minute when the regular attendant called in sick. She had worked private jets before, but nothing quite like this. The manifest showed one of the wealthiest men in America, his young daughter, and 5 women who all seemed to be traveling separately, but together, if that made sense. Sarah's job was simple: keep everyone comfortable, serve the gourmet meals, and stay invisible. Rich people, in her experience, preferred their service staff to blend into the background. But 20 minutes into the flight, as Sarah was checking on the passengers, she noticed something that made her heart clench. In the corner, away from all the adults who were chatting and laughing over champagne, sat a little girl clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. The child's eyes were wide with what looked like anxiety, and she was pressing herself as far into the corner of her seat as possible. Sarah recognized the look immediately. She had been that child once, the shy kid, overwhelmed by adult attention, desperate for someone to just see her, really see her, without expecting anything in return. Without really thinking about it, Sarah approached Emma's seat. "Hi there," she said softly, crouching down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "I'm Sarah. What's your rabbit's name?" Emma looked up, surprised that someone was actually asking about Mr. Hopscotch instead of trying to impress her with gifts. "His name is Mr. Hopscotch," she whispered. "Mr. Hopscotch is a very good name for a rabbit," Sarah said seriously. "Does he like to fly on airplanes?" Emma shook her head. "He gets scared when it's bumpy." "Well," Sarah said, reaching into her service cart and pulling out a small airline pin shaped like wings, "maybe this will help. These are special wings that help brave passengers feel safer in the sky. Would Mr. Hopscotch like to wear them?" For the first time since boarding, Emma smiled, just a little, but it was genuine. She carefully pinned the wings to Mr. Hopscotch's worn fur. "Thank you," she said. "You're very welcome," replied. "I'll check on you and Mr. Hopscotch in a little while, okay?" As Sarah moved away, she didn't notice that David Harrison had been watching the entire interaction, or that his expression had shifted from mild annoyance to something that looked almost like surprise. Over the next several hours, as the jet flew toward Colorado, the five women continued their carefully orchestrated campaign for Emma's and David's attention. Victoria discussed art history and classical music, demonstrating her cultural sophistication. Celeste shared amusing anecdotes from her legal career, proving her intelligence and wit. Madison talked about her latest real estate ventures, showcasing her business acumen. Priya sketched fashion designs and talked about traveling to Paris Fashion Week. Sophia described the winemaking process with passionate expertise. Each woman was impressive, accomplished, and clearly making an effort to include Emma in their conversations. But Emma remained withdrawn, giving polite one-word answers when addressed directly, and otherwise staying focused on Mr. Hopscotch. Sarah, meanwhile, was simply doing her job, serving drinks, checking on passengers, ensuring everyone was comfortable. But every time she passed Emma's seat, she paused for just a moment. Sometimes she'd ask how Mr. Hopscotch was feeling. Sometimes she'd point out interesting cloud formations through the window. Once, when the plane hit a patch of turbulence and Emma looked frightened, Sarah quickly appeared with a coloring book and crayons. "Sometimes, when I'm nervous, it helps to draw pictures," Sarah said quietly, sitting on the armrest of Emma's chair. "Would you like to try?" Emma nodded, and for the next half hour, she and Sarah colored together in comfortable silence. Sarah didn't ask questions or try to make conversation. She simply sat with Emma, occasionally commenting on her color choices or adding a small detail to her own drawing. It was the most relaxed Emma had looked since boarding the plane. David found himself watching this interaction too, though he told himself he was just making sure his daughter was being properly cared for. There was something about the way Sarah interacted with Emma, natural, unforced, genuine, that stood in stark contrast to the more orchestrated attention from the five women he had carefully selected. As the flight continued, the dynamics in the cabin began to shift in subtle ways. The five women, perhaps sensing that their initial approaches weren't working as well as hoped, began to try different tactics. Victoria brought out her phone to show Emma pictures of famous paintings, explaining each one in terms she thought a child would understand. Celeste started telling elaborate stories about courtroom dramas, casting herself as the brilliant lawyer who always saved the day. Madison pulled out her tablet to show Emma virtual tours of luxury homes she had designed. Priya began sketching Emma herself, promising to create a whole fashion collection inspired by her. Sophia started describing elaborate parties and events where Emma could be a princess. But with each new attempt, Emma seemed to shrink further into herself. The gifts that had been carefully placed around her seat remained largely untouched. The beautiful dresses Priya had brought stayed folded in their tissue paper. The jewelry box from Victoria sat unopened. Emma would nod politely when spoken to, but her attention always drifted back to Mr. Hopscotch and the small airline wing Sarah had given him. It was Sarah who noticed that Emma hadn't eaten anything since boarding. While the adults enjoyed a gourmet lunch of herb-crusted salmon and imported cheese, Emma had barely touched her specially prepared child's meal. "Mr. Hopscotch is looking a little worried," Sarah observed quietly, appearing beside Emma's seat again. "I think he might be wondering why his favorite girl isn't eating." Emma looked down at her untouched plate, then back at Sarah. "I'm not very hungry," she whispered. Sarah sat down in the empty seat across the aisle, technically against protocol, but something told her this was important. "Sometimes when I'm in new places with new people, my tummy feels too fluttery to eat too," she said. "But Mr. Hopscotch needs you to be strong, right? Maybe we could find something you'd like better." "I don't want to be any trouble," Emma said, echoing words she had clearly heard many times before. Sarah's heart broke a little. "You could never be trouble, Emma. Would you like to come with me to the galley? Maybe we can find something that Mr. Hopscotch would recommend." For the first time since boarding, Emma left her corner seat voluntarily. She followed Sarah to the small galley area, clutching Mr. Hopscotch tightly. Sarah showed her the different snacks and drinks available, letting Emma choose what appealed to her. They settled on apple slices with peanut butter and a cup of warm chocolate milk. "This is Mr. Hopscotch's favorite," Emma said seriously as she dipped an apple slice in peanut butter. "He has excellent taste," Sarah replied, and Emma giggled, the first genuine laugh anyone had heard from her all day. They were sharing this quiet moment when Victoria appeared in the galley doorway. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing back here?" she asked, her voice carrying just a hint of disapproval. "Come back to your proper seat. I was about to show you my photos from the Metropolitan Museum of Art." Emma looked between Victoria and Sarah, uncertainty flickering across her face. Before she could respond, Celeste appeared as well. "There you are! I was looking for you," Celeste said brightly. "I brought some games from my briefcase that I thought you might enjoy. Much more educational than whatever this is." Sarah started to step back. She knew her place, knew that these women were guests and she was staff. But Emma surprised everyone by moving closer to Sarah instead of toward the two women. "I like it here," Emma said quietly but firmly. "Sarah is showing me what Mr. Hopscotch likes to eat." Victoria and Celeste exchanged a look that clearly said, "Can you believe this child prefers the help to us?" But before either could respond, Madison, Priya, and Sophia had joined the crowd in the small galley space. "What's all the commotion?" Madison asked, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used in business meetings. "The little one seems to have gotten confused about where she belongs," Victoria said smoothly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She was about to apologize and encourage Emma to return to her seat when Emma did something that stunned everyone present. "I'm not confused," the 7-year-old said, her voice stronger than anyone had heard it all day. "I know exactly where I belong. I belong with people who are nice to me, not people who just want to impress my daddy." The silence that followed was deafening. 5 accomplished, sophisticated women stared down at a child who had just delivered one of the most honest assessments any of them had ever heard. Sarah stood frozen, uncertain whether she should apologize, retreat, or somehow diffuse the situation. It was Emma who broke the silence. Sarah doesn't try to give me fancy things, or tell me how pretty I am, or talk about boring grown-up stuff. She just cares about Mr. Hopscotch and makes sure I'm okay. That's what mommies are supposed to do, right? And that's when David Harrison appeared in the galley doorway, having heard the last part of his daughter's declaration. His steel-gray eyes took in the scene. 5 women who looked like they'd been slapped, 1 flight attendant who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, and his daughter, standing protectively close to the woman who had clearly earned her trust in ways that billions of dollars and careful planning had not. "Emma," he said quietly, "what's going on here?" Emma looked up at her father, and for a moment Sarah saw something shift in the child's expression. This was the moment of truth, the moment when Emma would either retreat into her typical shyness or find the courage to speak her truth. "Daddy," Emma said, her voice small but determined, "why did you bring all these ladies on our airplane?" David Harrison, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers and faced down hostile corporate boards, found himself struggling to answer his 7-year-old daughter's simple question. The 5 women watched expectantly. Sarah wished she could disappear, and Emma waited with the patient persistence that only children possess. I thought you might enjoy meeting them," David said carefully. "They're all very accomplished women." "But I don't need to meet accomplished women," Emma replied with devastating childhood logic. "I need someone who likes me, someone who cares about Mr. Hopscotch, someone who makes sure I eat my apples." She looked around at the 5 women, then back at her father. "These ladies are very pretty and very smart, but they don't really want to be my mommy. They want to marry you because you're rich and important. But Sarah—" Emma turned to look up at Sarah with complete trust in her green eyes. "Sarah just wants to make sure I'm happy." The words hung in the air like a challenge. David found himself looking at Sarah, really looking at her, for the first time since boarding. She was probably in her late 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Her uniform was crisp, but not expensive. Her jewelry was simple, just small pearl earrings and a practical watch. Everything about her spoke of someone who worked for a living, someone who understood that not everything in life could be bought. And his daughter, who had been withdrawn and anxious all day, was standing close to this woman like she represented safety in a world that suddenly felt too big and too complicated. What happened next would be talked about in certain circles for years to come, becoming the kind of story that gets whispered at exclusive country clubs and high-end charity events. But in that moment, suspended 30,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies, it was simply a father watching his daughter make a choice that would change all their lives. "I want her to be my new mommy, not any of you!" Emma's declaration rang out as she pointed directly at Sarah, and the silence that followed was unlike anything anyone on that plane had ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of profound silence that comes when the entire universe pauses to witness something extraordinary. Sarah's face went pale, then flushed red, then pale again. Her hands were shaking as she set down the cup of chocolate milk Emma had been drinking. This couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of mistake, some childish misunderstanding that could be quickly corrected and forgotten. "Emma, sweetheart," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you're confused. I'm just the flight attendant. I'm here to serve drinks and make sure everyone is comfortable. These lovely ladies are your father's friends, and I'm sure any one of them would be." "No," Emma said firmly, stepping even closer to Sarah and reaching for her hand. "I don't want any of them. I want you." Victoria Ashworth, who had been featured on the cover of Vogue 3 times and had never been rejected for anything in her life, let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said, her cultured voice sharp with indignation. "David, surely you're not going to let a child's tantrum dictate—" "It's not a tantrum," Emma interrupted, displaying a backbone no one knew she possessed. "I know what I want, and what I want is someone who sees me, really sees me, not just Daddy's money." Celeste stepped forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in as she tried to regain control of the situation. "Emma, darling, you're just overwhelmed. It's perfectly natural for children to become confused when meeting new people. Perhaps if we all just took a step back—" "I'm not confused." Emma's voice rose, and for the first time she sounded like a child who was genuinely upset rather than simply shy. "I'm 7 years old, not 2. I know the difference between people who like me and people who want something from my daddy." The brutal honesty of childhood is often more cutting than any adult criticism, and Emma's words hit their mark. Madison's perfectly composed expression faltered. Priya looked like she'd been slapped. Sophia's confident smile disappeared entirely. But it was Sarah who surprised everyone the most. Instead of backing down or apologizing or trying to redirect Emma's attention elsewhere, she knelt down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Emma," she said gently, "that's one of the sweetest things anyone has ever said to me. But being someone's mommy is a very big, very important job. It's not something that happens just because you want it to." "Why not?" Emma asked, her green eyes serious and intent. "You already take care of me better than anyone has since Mommy died. You notice when I'm scared. You make sure Mr. Hopscotch feels safe. You don't try to change me or make me be someone I'm not. Isn't that what mommies do?" Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, and she had to take a deep breath before responding. This child, this sweet, perceptive child, had somehow seen right through to the heart of what motherhood really meant. Not the fancy gifts or elaborate activities or attempts to impress, but simply caring about someone else's well-being more than your own comfort. "Yes," Sarah said quietly, "that is what mommies do. But Emma, honey, your daddy doesn't even know me. We're strangers, and I'm just a flight attendant. I'm not the kind of person who belongs in your world." It was David who answered, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What kind of person do you think belongs in our world, Sarah?" She looked up at him, this powerful man who could buy and sell companies the way other people bought groceries. And for a moment, she forgot about the difference in their circumstances. She just saw a father who was struggling to understand his daughter, and a man who might, just might, be questioning everything he thought he knew about what mattered. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Rich people, I suppose. Educated people. People who know how to navigate your social circles and business functions. People who can give Emma advantages I could never provide." "But what if Emma doesn't want advantages?" David asked, his steel-gray eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "What if she just wants someone who cares?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Meanwhile, the 5 women who had been so confident in their prospects just hours earlier were watching their carefully laid plans crumble before their eyes. "This is insane," Madison said, her businesslike demeanor cracking. "David, you can't seriously be considering. I mean, she's the help. She serves drinks for a living." "And what's wrong with serving drinks for a living?" Emma asked, her child's sense of fairness outraged. "Sarah works hard, she's nice to people, she takes care of people. What's wrong with that?" "Nothing's wrong with it, darling," Priya said, trying to salvage the situation with forced sweetness. "It's just that your daddy needs someone who can handle the responsibilities that come with being married to someone important." "Like what?" Emma challenged. The women exchanged glances, clearly struggling to explain the concept of social status to a 7-year-old without sounding completely shallow. "Well," Sophia tried, "there are charity events and business functions and social obligations." "Sarah could do those things," Emma said with complete confidence. "She's smart and pretty and nice. She could learn about wine and art and boring lawyer stuff if she wanted to. But she already knows the most important thing." "What's that?" David asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's perspective. "She knows how to love people," Emma said simply. "Real love, not the kind that comes with fancy presents and trying to impress everyone. The kind that notices when you're scared and makes sure you eat your apples." Comment below and let us know. Do you think love really can overcome differences in social status? In the silence that followed Emma's declaration, something shifted in the cabin. It was subtle but unmistakable, like the moment when a storm front moves in and you can feel the change in atmospheric pressure. The 5 women who had boarded the plane as confident contenders suddenly looked uncertain, defensive, and very much like people who had just realized they'd been playing the wrong game entirely. Sarah stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. Everything about this situation went against her training, her experience, and her understanding of how the world worked. Wealthy men didn't fall for flight attendants except in movies. Children didn't get to choose their parents' romantic partners. And she certainly didn't belong in a conversation about becoming anyone's stepmother, let alone the stepmother of a billionaire's daughter. But Emma was looking at her with such hope, such trust, such absolute certainty that Sarah was exactly what she needed. And David Harrison, intimidating, powerful David Harrison, was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "I need you to understand something very important. Your daddy and I don't know each other. We've never even had a real conversation before today. People don't just decide to become a family because a little girl thinks it's a good idea." "Why not?" Emma asked with the relentless logic of childhood. "Daddy picked these ladies because he thought they'd be good for me, right? But he was wrong. I'm picking you because I know you'd be good for us. Why is your way better than mine?" David found himself in the unprecedented position of having no good answer for his daughter's question. Everything Emma was saying made a twisted kind of sense. He had approached finding a wife like a business acquisition, evaluating candidates based on their qualifications on paper. But Emma was evaluating Sarah based on something far more important, how she made her feel. "Because, sweetheart," Victoria interjected, her patience clearly wearing thin, "marriage isn't a game. It's about compatibility, shared values, similar backgrounds." "Sarah and I have shared values," Emma interrupted. "We both think Mr. Hopscotch is important. We both like apple slices with peanut butter. We both think it's okay to be quiet sometimes. We both know that being nice is more important than being fancy." "Those aren't the kind of values she means, Emma," Celeste explained condescendingly. "She's talking about education, social position, financial stability." "I don't care about any of that stuff," Emma said firmly. "And if Daddy really loves me, he shouldn't care about it either. He should care about finding someone who makes me happy." The simple truth of it hit David like a physical blow. When had he started believing that love could be strategically planned and executed? When had he forgotten that happiness couldn't be purchased or negotiated? When had he lost sight of the fact that what Emma needed most wasn't a mother who looked good at charity galas, but someone who would notice when she was scared and sit with her until she felt safe? He looked at Sarah again, really looked at her this time. She was clearly overwhelmed by the situation, probably terrified of losing her job, definitely not prepared for any of this. But when Emma had been frightened by the turbulence, Sarah had appeared instantly with comfort and distraction. When Emma hadn't been eating, Sarah had noticed and found a solution. When Emma had felt lost in a crowd of adults all vying for attention, Sarah had simply seen her as a child who needed care. "Sarah," David said quietly, "would you sit down for a moment?" She glanced around the crowded galley, acutely aware that 5 pairs of eyes were watching her every move with varying degrees of hostility. "I should really get back to work, Mr. Harrison. I need to prepare for the descent into Denver and—" "Please," he said, and there was something in his voice that made it less of a request and more of a genuine plea. Just for a moment. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was still clutching her hand with both of hers, and found herself nodding. David gestured toward the main cabin, and somehow the whole group moved back there, Emma staying firmly attached to Sarah's side, the 5 women following with expressions ranging from disbelief to outrage, and David bringing up the rear with a thoughtful expression. Once they were all settled back in the main seating area, David took a deep breath and did something that no one, least of all himself, had expected. He ignored the 5 women he had carefully selected and courted and focused entirely on the flight attendant his daughter had chosen. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah," he said simply. "Mr. Harrison, I really don't think this is appropriate. Please," Emma chimed in, settling herself as close to Sarah as she could manage. "Tell Daddy about you so he'll understand why I picked you." Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces watching her, some hostile, one hopeful, one unreadable, and felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea whether there was water or rocks below. But Emma was looking at her with such trust, such certainty that Sarah was worth defending, that she found herself beginning to talk. "I'm 28 years old," she began hesitantly. "I've been a flight attendant for 8 years. Before that, I was in college studying elementary education, but I had to drop out when my mother got sick. The medical bills were substantial, so I took this job because it paid well enough for me to help with her care and still support myself." She paused, wondering if she should continue, but Emma squeezed her hand encouragingly. "My mother died 2 years ago," Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger. "Cancer. I stayed with this job because by then it was what I knew. And honestly, I like taking care of people. I like making sure travelers are comfortable and safe. I've seen people at their worst, scared of flying, missing connections, dealing with family emergencies. And I've learned that sometimes the smallest kindness can make the biggest difference in someone's day." She looked directly at Emma as she spoke the next words. "I know what it's like to be scared and overwhelmed and to just need someone to notice that you're struggling. I know what it's like to feel invisible in a room full of adults who are too busy with important things to see that you need help. And I know what it's like to lose the person who loved you most in the world and wonder if anyone will ever really see you again." The last words came out in a whisper, and Sarah realized she was crying, just a little, just enough that Emma noticed and reached up to gently wipe away a tear. "See, Daddy," Emma said softly, "she understands about losing mommies. She understands about being sad and scared. She understands me." David Harrison had built his fortune by reading people, by understanding what motivated them, what they wanted, what they feared. In boardrooms and negotiation sessions, he could spot a lie or a hidden agenda from across the table. But looking at Sarah now, this woman who had just bared her heart to a cabin full of strangers because his daughter had asked her to, he saw something he hadn't encountered in years of business dealings. He saw complete, unguarded honesty. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said quietly, and meant it. "Thank you," Sarah replied. She would have loved Emma. She always said that children were the most honest people in the world, that they could see right through to what really mattered in people. "It seems she was right," David said, glancing at his daughter, who was still holding Sarah's hand like a lifeline. Victoria could stand it no longer. "David, this is all very touching, but surely you can see that this is completely impractical. This woman, Sarah, she's lovely, I'm sure, but she has no idea what it means to be part of your world. The social obligations, the media attention, the business functions." "I could learn," Sarah said quietly, surprising everyone, including herself. "I mean, not that I'm saying I don't want to presume anything, but if someone wanted to teach me about wine or art or business etiquette, I could learn. I'm not stupid." "Of course you're not stupid," Madison said with forced patience, "but there's a difference between learning about these things and truly understanding them, truly belonging in these circles." "What circles?" Emma interrupted, her 7-year-old confusion cutting through the adult pretense. "What are you talking about? Daddy's friends are just people. They put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everyone else." Despite everything, David found himself suppressing a smile. Emma had clearly been listening to her late mother's sayings, and Jennifer had always been fond of that particular phrase whenever David got too caught up in the importance of his business associates. "It's more complicated than that, sweetheart," Priya explained with exaggerated patience. "There are expectations, social rules, ways of behaving in certain situations." "Like being nice to people and not talking down to them?" Emma asked innocently. "Like not making people feel bad because they don't have as much money as you do? Like actually caring about people instead of just pretending to care?" The silence that followed was deafening. In her childish directness, Emma had managed to expose the very attitudes that she found so off-putting about the 5 women. They weren't unkind people, but they were people who had lived lives of privilege for so long that they had forgotten how to relate to anyone who hadn't shared that experience. Sarah, meanwhile, was staring at her hands, overwhelmed by the surreal turn her ordinary workday had taken. 6 hours ago, she had been worried about remembering which passenger wanted ice with their whiskey and which preferred it neat. Now she was somehow in the middle of a conversation about marriage and motherhood with a man she had never met and a child she had known for less than a day. "This is crazy," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "This whole thing is completely insane." "Why?" David asked, and his voice was so quiet, so genuinely curious, that Sarah looked up at him in surprise. "Because," she gestured around the luxurious cabin, at the designer clothes and expensive jewelry and aura of wealth that surrounded everything. "Because I don't belong here, because you don't know me, because your daughter is a sweet little girl who's probably just confused and overwhelmed, and tomorrow when she's back in her normal routine, she'll forget all about the flight attendant who gave her rabbit some wings." "No," Emma said with absolute certainty. "I'll never forget you, Sarah, and I don't want you to be just a memory. I want you to be my mommy." The simple declaration hung in the air, and Sarah felt something crack open in her chest, a mixture of hope and terror and disbelief that someone could want her so completely, so immediately, so purely. David Harrison had spent his entire adult life making calculated decisions based on risk assessment, market analysis, and strategic planning. He had never made an important choice based on instinct or emotion or the earnest plea of a 7-year-old child. But sitting there, watching his daughter cling to this woman who had shown her more genuine care in a few hours than anyone had in months, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about what made a good mother, a good partner, a good life. "Sarah," he said carefully, "if you could have anything in the world, anything at all, what would it be?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before, not seriously. The foster family she had lived with as a teenager had been focused on rules and expectations. The various boyfriends over the years had been interested in what she could give them, not what she wanted for herself. Even her dying mother had been too consumed with medical treatments and hospital bills to ask about dreams and wishes. Sarah started, then stopped, then started again. "I used to want to be a teacher. Before my mother got sick, before I had to drop out of college, I wanted to work with elementary school kids, to be the kind of adult who really listened to them, who saw them as whole people instead of just small versions of adults." "Why?" David asked. "Because children are honest," Sarah said, unconsciously echoing Emma's earlier observation about her grandmother. "They haven't learned yet that they're supposed to hide what they really feel or pretend to be someone they're not. They just are. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's something worth protecting." Emma beamed at this answer, as if Sarah had just validated everything she believed about herself and the world. "See, Daddy, she understands kids. She understands me." But Victoria wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Understanding children and being equipped to raise a child in David's circumstances are two entirely different things," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Emma will need tutors, private schools, exposure to culture and refinement." "She'll need love," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "She'll need someone who pays attention to her, who notices when she's scared or sad or excited. She'll need someone who values her thoughts and feelings, not someone who's trying to turn her into a perfect little accessory for her father's lifestyle." The words came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended, and she immediately regretted them. These women weren't cruel people. They were just people who had lived in a different world for so long that they had lost touch with some fundamental truths about what children actually needed. But Emma was nodding vigorously. "Yes, that's exactly right. I don't want to be an accessory. I want to be me." Sophia made one last attempt to restore reason to the situation. "Emma, darling, you're being very unfair to these lovely ladies. We all care about you." "No, you don't," Emma said with devastating honesty. "You care about impressing my daddy. You care about marrying someone rich and important. You might be nice to me if you had to be, but you don't actually care about me. Not really. Not the way Sarah does." The accusation hung in the air, and none of the 5 women could quite bring themselves to deny it. They had been focused on winning David's approval, on proving their suitability as wives for a billionaire. Emma had been a factor in that equation, but not the primary consideration. Sarah, meanwhile, had never even thought about impressing David. She had simply seen a scared little girl and responded with instinctive kindness. The fact that it had led to this extraordinary moment was as shocking to her as it was to everyone else. "Emma," David said quietly, "are you absolutely sure about this? About Sarah?" Emma looked around the cabin at all the adults watching her, then up at Sarah's face, then back at her father. "Daddy, when Mommy died, you told me that sometimes God sends angels to help us when we need them most. Maybe Sarah is my angel." The reference to Jennifer hit David like a physical blow. His late wife had indeed said something very similar during her final days in the hospital, telling Emma that angels didn't always have wings and halos,
that sometimes they just looked like regular people who showed up exactly when you needed them most. David looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and tried to imagine what his life would be like if he took his daughter's advice. If he abandoned his carefully laid plans and strategic thinking and followed his heart instead of his head. If he chose love over logic, authenticity over status, genuine connection over social compatibility. The thought terrified him. It also thrilled him in a way he hadn't felt since he was young and stupid and madly in love with Jennifer. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know this is completely insane. I know we just met. I know this goes against every rational thought either of us should be having. But," he paused, looking at his daughter's hopeful face, "would you be willing to have dinner with Emma and me when we get back to San Francisco? Just dinner. No pressure, no expectations. Just a chance to get to know each other like normal people do." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Billionaires didn't fall for flight attendants, and 7-year-olds didn't get to choose their stepmothers, and fairy tales definitely didn't come true at 30,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. But Emma was looking at her with such hope, such trust, such absolute certainty that this was exactly what was supposed to happen. And David Harrison, intimidating, powerful, completely out of her league David Harrison, was looking at her like she might actually be the answer to a question he hadn't even known he was asking. Sarah started, then stopped, then started again. "I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Emma's face was brighter than the sun streaming through the airplane windows. She threw her arms around Sarah's waist and held on tight, as if she could keep this moment from slipping away through sheer force of will. "Really?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against Sarah's uniform jacket. "You really want to have dinner with us?" "Really," Sarah confirmed, and felt something shift in her chest, a door opening to possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. The 5 women who had boarded this flight as confident contenders were now watching their carefully laid plans crumble before their eyes. Victoria was the first to recover her composure. "Well," she said, standing and smoothing down her designer dress, "I think it's clear that this situation has become rather unusual. David, I'm sure when you've had time to think rationally about this, you'll realize—" "I'm thinking very rationally," David interrupted, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "For the first time in years, I'm thinking about what actually matters instead of what looks good on paper." Celeste stood as well, her lawyer instincts telling her that this battle was lost. "This is a mistake, David. You'll realize that eventually." "Maybe," David acknowledged, "but maybe the biggest mistake I've made was thinking that love could be strategically planned and executed like a business deal." One by one, the 5 women gathered their belongings and moved to seats at the opposite end of the cabin, making it clear that they considered this entire episode beneath their dignity. They would be polite for the remainder of the flight, but their interest in David Harrison and his daughter had evaporated the moment it became clear that wealth and status weren't going to be the deciding factors. With the tension in the air finally beginning to dissipate, Sarah found herself alone with David and Emma for the first time since this extraordinary drama had begun. Emma was still clinging to her like a barnacle, clearly afraid that if she let go, Sarah might disappear. "Emma," Sarah said gently, "I need you to understand something very important. Your daddy and I agreeing to have dinner doesn't mean we're getting married. It doesn't mean I'm going to be your stepmother. It just means we're going to get to know each other better and see if we might be compatible." "What does compatible mean?" Emma asked. "It means whether we like the same things, whether we make each other happy, whether we want the same things out of life," David explained. "It means finding out if we could be a good family together." Emma considered this seriously. "I already know we're compatible," she announced. "Sarah likes Mr. Hopscotch, and she makes good chocolate milk, and she doesn't try to make me be someone I'm not. That's all I need." "But it's not all I need," Sarah said gently, "and it's not all your daddy needs either. We need to find out if we can be good partners for each other, not just good friends for you." She looked at David as she said this and found him watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. There was something in his eyes, appreciation perhaps, or respect, that suggested he understood exactly what she was trying to communicate. "You're right," David said quietly. "Emma's happiness is the most important thing, but it's not the only thing. Sarah and I need to find out if we can build something real together, something that will last and grow and be good for all of us." "So we're going to date?" Emma asked, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "We're going to get to know each other," Sarah corrected with a smile. "There's a difference." What do you think will happen when they have that dinner? Share your predictions in the comments below.
The rest of the flight passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. Sarah returned to her duties, serving the final beverage service and preparing the cabin for landing, but everything felt different now. The simple tasks she had performed thousands of times before, collecting trash, checking seatbelts, ensuring tray tables were upright, felt charged with new meaning now that David Harrison was watching her work with genuine interest rather than polite indifference. Emma, meanwhile, had claimed the seat directly next to Sarah's jump seat and was chattering away about all the things she wanted to show Sarah when they got to San Francisco. Her house, her room, her collection of stuffed animals, the treehouse her mother had helped her father build in their backyard before she got sick. "And we have a swimming pool," Emma announced. "Do you know how to swim, Sarah?" "I do," Sarah confirmed, checking her watch and noting that they would be beginning their descent soon. "Though I haven't been swimming in a while." "Daddy could teach you to swim better," Emma said helpfully. "He's a really good swimmer. He taught me how to do the backstroke and everything." David, who had been trying to focus on some paperwork, looked up at this. "I'm not sure Sarah needs swimming lessons, Emma." "Everyone can always get better at swimming," Emma said with the confidence of a child who had recently mastered the backstroke. "Besides, it would be fun. We could all swim together like a real family." The casual way she said, "like a real family," made both adults pause. There was such longing in those words, such hope, such absolute faith that this was all going to work out exactly as she had envisioned. "Emma," Sarah said carefully, "I want you to remember that your daddy and I are just going to have dinner together. One dinner. We might decide we don't like each other very much, or that we don't have enough in common, or that we're better off as friends." "But you will like each other," Emma said with unshakable certainty. "I can tell." "How can you tell?" David asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's reasoning. "Because you both like me," Emma said simply. "And people who both like the same person usually like each other too. Plus, Sarah makes you smile." "She does?" David asked, surprised. "You've been smiling ever since I picked her," Emma pointed out. "Not your business smile that you use when people come to the house to talk about money. Your real smile, like you used to do with Mommy." David felt his throat tighten. He had thought he'd been more careful about hiding his grief from Emma, but clearly she had been paying attention to more than he realized. "You're very observant," he said quietly. "Mommy always said I was a good watcher," Emma replied. She said watching and listening were the most important things you could do if you wanted to understand people. Sarah felt her heart clench at the matter-of-fact way Emma spoke about her mother. This child had already experienced more loss than many adults, yet she had somehow managed to hold on to her capacity for hope, for trust, for love. The resilience of children never failed to amaze her. The pilot's voice came over the intercom announcing their initial descent into Denver, and Sarah automatically began her pre-landing routine. But as she moved through the cabin checking that everything was secured, she found herself stealing glances at David and Emma, still hardly able to believe that her life had taken such an extraordinary turn. In all her years of flying, she had seen countless passengers come and go. Business executives, celebrities, politicians, ordinary families on vacation. They were all just temporary fixtures in her working life, people she served politely and forgot as soon as they deplaned. Never had she imagined that one flight, one passenger, one spontaneous act of kindness toward a shy little girl could change everything. But that's exactly what had happened. In the space of a single flight, her entire future had been rewritten by a 7-year-old who had seen something in her that no one else, including herself, had ever recognized. As they descended through the clouds toward Denver International Airport, Sarah caught David watching her again. This time, instead of looking away embarrassed, she met his gaze directly. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly, moving close enough that Emma couldn't overhear. "About dinner, I mean. Your daughter is wonderful, but she's also 7 years old. 7-year-olds aren't known for their judgment about adult relationships."
David considered her question seriously. "A week ago, I would have said you were absolutely right. I would have said that children should be seen and not heard when it comes to important decisions. But Emma was right about those 5 women. They were more interested in impressing me than in caring for her. And she was right about you, too. In a few hours, you've shown more genuine interest in her well-being than anyone has since her mother died." He paused, looking over at Emma, who was carefully adjusting Mr. Hopscotch's tiny airline wings. "Maybe 7-year-olds see things that adults miss because we're too busy overthinking everything," he continued. "Maybe sometimes the heart knows things that the head hasn't figured out yet." Sarah felt her breath catch. This wasn't the response she had expected from a man who had built a business empire through careful analysis and strategic planning. This was the response of a father who was learning to see his daughter and himself with new eyes. The plane touched down in Denver with barely a bump, and as they taxied toward the gate, Emma began gathering her things with the excitement of someone who felt like her whole life was about to begin. "Sarah," she said, hugging Mr. Hopscotch tightly, "thank you for making this the best airplane ride ever." "Thank you, Emma," Sarah replied, and meant it. "Thank you for choosing me." As the passengers began to deplane, the 5 women who had boarded with such high hopes filed past without a word. Victoria gave David a cold nod. Celeste muttered something about hoping he would come to his senses. Madison, Priya, and Sophia simply gathered their designer luggage and disappeared into the jetway without looking back. David, Emma, and Sarah were the last to leave the plane. "So," David said as they stood in the jetway, suddenly awkward now that they were back in the real world, "dinner, when you get back to San Francisco." "When I get back to San Francisco," Sarah agreed, still hardly able to believe this was really happening. "Daddy," Emma said, tugging on his hand, "can Sarah ride in our car to the hotel, please?" David looked at Sarah questioningly. "We're staying overnight in Denver before flying back tomorrow. You're welcome to join us for dinner tonight if you don't have other plans." Sarah's standard operating procedure would have been to politely decline.
to maintain professional boundaries, to remember her place. But Emma was looking at her with such hope, and David was looking at her with such genuine warmth. And for once, in her carefully controlled life, she decided to say yes to something that felt scary and wonderful and completely unprecedented. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Emma's cheer of delight echoed through the jetway, causing other passengers to turn and stare. But for once, Sarah didn't care about attracting attention or maintaining a professional demeanor or any of the rules that had governed her life for so long. She was too busy falling in love with a little girl who had seen her heart so clearly, and maybe, just maybe, with the father who was learning to see with his daughter's eyes. 3 months later, Sarah Chen was sitting in the front row of St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco, wearing a simple but elegant ivory dress that Emma had helped her pick out. Mr. Hopscotch, sporting tiny satin ribbons that matched the wedding colors, was seated in the place of honor next to Emma, who was bouncing excitedly in her flower girl dress. The whirlwind courtship that had followed their Denver dinner had surprised everyone, including Sarah and David themselves. What had started as one careful, tentative dinner had turned into weekend outings, family movie nights, long conversations over coffee while Emma played in the park. Sarah had met David's friends and business associates, who had initially been skeptical but had quickly been won over by her genuine warmth and unaffected manner. David had met Sarah's small circle of friends from the airline, who had been shocked but thrilled to see their quiet, reserved colleague blossom under the attention of a man who clearly adored her. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. There had been awkward moments at charity galas where Sarah had felt out of place among the society crowd. There had been business functions where she had struggled with the unspoken rules and expectations. There had been moments when the differences in their backgrounds had seemed too vast to bridge. But every time Sarah had felt overwhelmed by David's world, Emma had been there to remind her why she belonged. And every time David had wondered if he was being fair to ask Sarah to adapt to such a different lifestyle, she had shown him that love was indeed stronger than circumstance, that authenticity was more valuable than social status, that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than shared bank accounts. The media had, predictably, had a field day with the story. "Billionaire abandons society beauties for flight attendant" had been one of the more tactful headlines. But David Harrison, who had spent years carefully managing his public image, had surprised everyone by simply not caring what the gossip columnists said. For the first time in his adult life, he was more interested in his family's happiness than in public opinion. Now, as Sarah waited for the music to begin, she thought about how much her life had changed since that extraordinary flight. She was still working, she had insisted on that, though now she flew part-time and was taking evening classes to finish her education degree. David had initially tried to convince her that she didn't need to work, but Sarah had explained that taking care of people wasn't just her job, it was part of who she was. She couldn't be happy sitting at home being a trophy wife, no matter how much she loved him and Emma. The compromise they had reached was perfect. Sarah continued flying 2 days a week while pursuing her teaching degree, and David had established a scholarship fund for children of airline employees who wanted to pursue higher education. It was, Sarah had told him, the perfect wedding gift. Not jewelry or a car or some other expensive token, but a way to help other people who were working hard to build better lives for themselves and their families. The organ music began, and David appeared at the altar looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. This was a man who had addressed shareholders, negotiated with world leaders, spoken at international conferences, but apparently the prospect of marrying the woman his daughter had chosen for him was more terrifying than any business deal. Emma, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement as she prepared to walk down the aisle.
She had taken her role as matchmaker very seriously, frequently reminding anyone who would listen that she had known Sarah was perfect for them from the very first moment.
"You ready, kiddo?" Sarah asked, smoothing down Emma's dress one last time. "I've been ready since the airplane," Emma said solemnly. "Are you ready, Sarah?" Sarah looked down the aisle at David, who was watching them both with an expression of wonder and gratitude and love so pure it made her breath catch. A year ago, she had been just another invisible service worker, someone who brought people drinks and cleaned up their messes and tried her best to make their journeys a little more comfortable. She had never imagined that her life could become something magical, something wonderful, something worthy of fairy tales. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they began their walk down the aisle, Sarah in ivory, Emma in pale pink, Mr. Hopscotch sporting his satin ribbons, Sarah thought about all the passengers she had served over the years who had seemed to have perfect lives. The wealthy couples who barely spoke to each other, the successful executives who looked miserable despite their achievements, the families who bickered constantly despite their designer clothes and expensive vacations. She had envied them once, thinking that money and status would automatically bring happiness. Now she understood that the most important things in life couldn't be purchased or strategically acquired. Love, trust, genuine connection, the feeling of being truly seen and valued for who you really were, these were gifts that could only be given freely, and only to those who were brave enough to open their hearts to unexpected possibilities. As she reached the altar and took David's trembling hand, Sarah thought about the moment on the airplane when Emma had pointed at her and declared her choice to a cabin full of shocked adults. It had been the bravest thing she had ever witnessed. A child refusing to accept what looked right on paper and instead choosing what felt right in her heart. "Thank you," David whispered as the minister began to speak. And Sarah knew he wasn't just thanking her for marrying him, but for seeing Emma so clearly, for loving them both so completely, for having the courage to believe that a flight attendant and a billionaire and a wise little girl could indeed make a family together. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for raising a daughter who knows what really matters." The ceremony was beautiful, but simple. The reception warm, but not ostentatious. The guests were a mix of David's business associates and Sarah's friends from the airline, creating the kind of social diversity that would have horrified the 5 women who had once competed for David's attention. Victoria, Celeste, Madison, Priya, and Sophia had all sent polite decline cards, making it clear that they considered this entire episode beneath their notice. But Emma, the real architect of this union, was in her element. She danced with her new stepmother, charmed the guests with stories about how she had known from the very beginning that Sarah was perfect for them, and made sure that Mr. Hopscotch had a proper seat at the head table. During the father-daughter dance, David held Emma close and whispered, "You were right, sweetheart. You were right about everything." "I know," Emma said with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own judgment. "Mommies are supposed to see you, really see you. Sarah sees us both." As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Sarah found herself standing on the terrace of the country club, looking out at the San Francisco Bay and marveling at how dramatically her life had changed. A year ago, she had been alone in a small apartment, working long hours to pay bills, and wondering if she would ever find someone who could love her for who she truly was, rather than who they wanted her to be. David joined her on the terrace, loosening his tie with relief.
"No regrets?" he asked, slipping his arms around her from behind. "Only one," Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. "What's that?" "I wish my mother could have been here to meet you and Emma," Sarah said quietly. "She would have loved you both, and she would have been so proud to see her daughter marrying for love instead of security." "She would have been proud of you regardless," David said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Harrison." Sarah Harrison. It would take some getting used to, but she had to admit it had a nice ring to it. Emma appeared on the terrace, having changed out of her flower girl dress and into comfortable pajamas. "Are we ready to go home now?" she asked, slipping between them and taking both their hands. "We're ready," Sarah said, squeezing Emma's small hand in hers. As they walked back toward the main dining room to collect their things, Emma looked up at her new stepmother with satisfaction. "I told you it would work out," she said. "I told you we were compatible." "Yes, you did," Sarah agreed. "You're a very smart girl, Emma Harrison." "The smartest," Emma said matter-of-factly. "That's why I got to pick my own mommy instead of letting Daddy do it. Grown-ups don't always know what they need, but kids do." Sarah and David exchanged a look over Emma's head, both thinking the same thing. Out of the mouths of babes. Later that night, after Emma had been tucked into bed with Mr. Hopscotch and his satin ribbons, after the wedding dress had been carefully hung in the closet, after the makeup had been washed off and the formal shoes had been kicked aside, Sarah and David sat together on the couch in their family room, still hardly able to believe that this was really their life now. "Do you think she knew?" Sarah asked, curled up against David's side. "Do you think Emma somehow knew that we would fall in love?" "I think Emma knew that you would love her unconditionally," David said thoughtfully. "And I think she knew that I would fall in love with anyone who could see her the way you do, as a complete person, worthy of respect and care, not just as an accessory to my lifestyle." "She's remarkable," Sarah said softly. "I've never met a child with such clear instincts about people." "She gets that from her mother," David said, his voice soft with memory. "Jennifer always said that Emma had an old soul, that she could see right through to people's hearts." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of the city twinkle through their living room windows. Tomorrow they would begin their honeymoon, a simple trip to a cabin in Lake Tahoe where Emma could swim and hike and show Sarah all her favorite spots from previous family vacations. It wasn't the exotic international destination that David's wealth could have afforded, but it was exactly what Sarah had requested. Time for the three of them to be together as a family, away from business obligations and social expectations, and the curious eyes of people who were still trying to figure out how a flight attendant had managed to capture the heart of one of America's most eligible bachelors. The answer, of course, was simple. She hadn't tried to capture anything. She had simply seen a scared little girl and offered comfort. She had simply been herself, kind, genuine, unimpressed by wealth and status, focused on what really mattered. In a world where David Harrison was surrounded by people who wanted something from him, Sarah Chen had been the one person who had asked for nothing except the chance to take care of his daughter. "I love you," David said quietly, pressing a kiss to Sarah's temple. "I love you too," she replied, then smiled. "Both of you. All three of us, actually, if we're counting Mr. Hopscotch." "We should probably count Mr. Hopscotch," David said seriously. "He seems to be a very important member of this family." "The most important," Sarah agreed. "After all, if Emma hadn't been worried about him being scared during the flight, I might never have approached her seat in the first place." "So we owe our happiness to a stuffed rabbit," David mused. "We owe our happiness to a little girl who was brave enough to choose love over everything else," Sarah corrected, "and to her father, who was wise enough to listen." Upstairs, Emma was lying in her new bedroom, beautifully decorated, but still filled with all her familiar treasures, whispering to Mr. Hopscotch about their wonderful day. "See," she told the worn stuffed rabbit, "I told you Sarah would be perfect for us. I told you she would make Daddy smile his real smile again. I told you we would be a real family." Mr. Hopscotch, of course, said nothing, but his airline wings caught the moonlight streaming through the window, and if rabbits could smile, he would have been grinning from ear to ear. As Emma drifted off to sleep, she thought about the airplane ride that had started it all. She had been so scared that day, so overwhelmed by all the fancy ladies trying to impress her father, so desperate for someone who would just see her as Emma instead of as the billionaire's daughter who needed to be won over. And then Sarah had appeared, asking about Mr. Hopscotch, offering comfort without expecting anything in return, proving that sometimes the best things in life came in the most unexpected packages. Emma smiled in her sleep, secure in the knowledge that she had done exactly what her mother would have wanted her to do. She had chosen love over everything else, and love had chosen them back. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of how love can bloom in the most unexpected places, make sure to share it with someone who believes in the power of authentic connection. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories about real people finding extraordinary love in ordinary moments. Sometimes the best fairy tales are the ones that happen 30,000 feet above the ground, and sometimes the wisest matchmakers are the ones who still believe in magic. Until next time, remember that love doesn't care about social status, bank accounts, or carefully laid plans. Love only cares about the size of your heart and the courage to follow it, even when it leads you somewhere you never expected to go.